Welcome to Unraveling Behavior, a science podcast from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Hi everyone. Today's episode might just make you a little hungry. We're diving into a popular idea in food psychology, which says that people make over 200 food decisions a day, often without even realizing it. But where does that number come from? Does it actually make sense? And what does it tell us about how we eat? To help us understand this better, I'm joined by Almudena Claassen. Almudena has a PhD in social psychology and is a postdoctoral researcher here at our institute. She recently co-authored a paper that questions the way food decisions have been measured and suggests a better way to do it. So, let's hear all about it. Here's Almudena Claassen. Hi, Almudena. Thanks for being here. It's great to have you.
Hi, Sophia. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Let's start with this popular claim that people make over 200 food decisions a day, often without even realizing it. Where does that number come from?
So that number comes from a study conducted in 2007 by two scientists called Brian Wansink and Jeffrey Sobel, who used to work at Cornell University. And they were very interested to know how many food and beverages decisions people make in one day. And they studied this by asking a group of university students two questions. So the first question would be, Sophia, can you tell me or can you give me an estimate of the amount of food and beverages decisions you make in one day? And you can consider meals, snacks, and beverages in your estimate.
Okay, so let's start then with lunch. Okay, maybe I decide on the main dish. Then I decide if I'm going to have something for dessert, typically is fruit. Then maybe whether I have a coffee or a tea afterwards. Maybe the same for dinner, right? So that would bring us to maybe already 6 decisions. Then for breakfast, yogurt with some cereal. And then I usually drink coffee, which is, that's sort of more of a habit I have. Yeah, then I also have some snacks, so snacks also count, right? Maybe, let's say 4, like fruit and some nuts, maybe some chocolate, with hazelnut. It's the one I like. And, well, that brings us to, say, the 12, and maybe some, 2 or 3 cups of tea. So let's say 15.
Okay. Seems sensible, and it's almost exactly what the researchers found. So they found that on average, people make 14 decisions about food a day. But then I come back to you, and I come with the second question, and I ask you, okay, now, Sophia, please estimate how many decisions about food and beverages you make regarding what you eat, how much of it you have, where you eat it, when you eat it, and with whom you eat it. And that for a typical meal, snack, and beverage on a typical day.
Okay, so let's start with a typical meal. You've asked me, for example, about when decisions. Okay, maybe I would say I first decide when I start cooking. Then I decide, okay, when the cooking is done. Then I decide when to serve, how much to serve, right? I might also save some for later. Then I also decide when to start eating, when to stop eating, and even when I cook, do all the ingredients count? I cook a lot of vegetables, so that could be like 10 ingredients going into a single dish. So that's hard to count. And I think the idea here is that you're really kind of breaking it down, right? It's hard to say, but I guess much more than just 15, right?
Yeah, I think it was easier for the participants because they could write down how many they were making for each component. So the researchers took these estimates and then they multiplied it by the number of meals, snacks, and beverages the participants reported consuming on this typical day. And then when everything was added up, the average number of decisions was 226, so a lot more than the estimate they got with the first question. And then what they did was compare these two numbers, so 14 and 226, and the difference, which is 212, they concluded that that is the amount of mindless decisions that people make about food and beverages on one day. So decisions that you don't think about when you're making them.
So that's a lot. I mean, that's like one mindless decision every 5 minutes, right? If you just count for waking hours.
Yes, so it might sound like a lot, like we're like constantly busy with food decisions. But if you think about it, it's likely that these decisions are clustered around specific times. So as you said, when you're preparing a meal or eating a meal, there's a lot of decisions that go into that single meal. So you can, imagine that these decisions are clustered around eating times or shopping times, etc.
So you recently published a paper together with Jutta Mata and Ralph Hertwig, where you argue that this 200 decisions estimate is essentially meaningless. Could you explain why you believe that's the case?
Sure. So we argue that these 200 decisions, or this estimate, it's meaningless because of the way it was studied, it was measured with these two questions that I asked you. Because the way you ask people a question, whether it's broad or detailed, influences how often people think that something happens. So if you break down one event into like specific separate parts, it's more likely to be judged to happen more frequently. And this is called the sub-additivity effect. And it's like a well-researched and well-established cognitive bias that we know about. And basically it illustrates that if you make estimates, like separate estimates for specific parts, they tend to add up to more than when you make one general estimate about a single thing. And the reason this happens is that because if you list like specific components, like the food decisions, people basically just remember.
It facilitates recall.
Right? Like in the general question, you're thinking about, okay, what did I have for my meal? But then if I give you all these several components, you think, okay, yeah, I also decided when to eat it or where to eat it. And this simply did not come up in your mind when you were thinking about the general question. So like sub-additivity inflates these estimates, but it doesn't mean that these decisions were made mindlessly. It's just you didn't think about them, like remember them or consider them as a decision while you were answering the other question.
Yeah. And my feeling also when you were asking me the questions was that when you ask me about all these components, I, as a participant, also have a better idea of what the scientists have in mind. What for them is a decision, because you're giving me these cues, these hints. Whereas if you just ask me a general question, is more ill-defined, right? It makes the participant wonder, okay, does that actually count?
I mean, you still had this question, right? Like, does every single ingredient count? And
I did, yeah.
This was not so clearly defined for participants either. So besides, this additivity effect that we see, it's also about how the researchers defined the decisions or the components to participants that are really arbitrary. Because yes, I could ask you in general, what did you eat or which ingredient, like all the specific ingredients that you decided to put in your meal. And this would give a very different number.
It is well known that Brian Van Zink, right, that's the name of the first author of this study, that he was found by Cornell University to have committed academic misconduct. And we're talking about like misreporting scientific results and things like that. But in this case, you're not saying that this estimate, that this 200 estimate, that it's intentionally deceptive.
No, we are not. So his work has been evaluated and like 18 of his papers have been retracted, but this paper was not. So we have no reason to believe that it was a fraudulent study. And we're just basically arguing that the method they used cannot tell us how many mindless food decisions people make. So indeed, not intentionally, but just a misleading, arbitrary number.
And why do you think it is important for people to know that this number might not mean much?
Now, for one, like this number really like took off, and it's like often mentioned in the media, and even lay people know about this number. It's like often cited in academic work. It has like almost 500 academic citations, but no one has ever questioned where does this number come from, or like tried to replicate it and tried to see whether, usually you need multiple studies, right, to say that okay, this is some evidence that we can trust, and this has never happened.
So it's a one-time finding.
It's a one-time finding, but yeah, people just keep reporting this number.
It's so catchy.
It's so catchy. It's a great number, but yeah. And the reason we think it's important that people know that it's based on this flawed methodology is because if people think that they make so many mindless decisions, then they're going to feel that there's no point in trying to improve your diet or your food decisions because, most of them you're making without knowing you're making them. So, if you think, oh, I want to improve my conscious decisions, there's only 14 or something, whatever you want to say that I can actually improve.
It makes you feel like you lack control.
Exactly.
Like you're just helpless.
Yeah. And we see this also with other effects or other things, like the idea that we have to take 10,000 steps a day to be like fit or healthy, which is also a completely random number and not a scientific benchmark. Science actually shows that you need half of this amount of steps to be fine.
And all the watches and all have this number on, right?
Yeah.
Like people really seek to achieve the 10,000 steps a day.
Yeah, exactly. People really, really are trying to reach this, and it just becomes demotivating if the benchmark we're trying to reach is too high.
And would you say that this type of finding can also influence the decisions that policymakers make, about how to get people to make better food choices?
Yeah, totally. It's a bit the same idea as for, ourselves. That if policymakers think that people make so many mindless decisions, then they're also going to think, okay, we cannot, educate them, for instance, to make better decisions or teach them like skills and competences to influence their eating decisions. But they're going to focus on trying to work on these mindless people that are just mindlessly making decisions around them. And then the problem is that if indeed we don't make all these mindless decisions, but policymakers target their interventions on this level, then there's going to be a mismatch between, what people's behavior actually is and what the interventions do. And then we're not going to create effective interventions.
The 200 decisions estimate then isn't very useful. Okay, now what? Would you say that we just need to get a better number? Or is there like a deeper question that we should be asking?
So it's very tempting to come up with a better number, a better estimate. And we were also tempted to do that. But in thinking of ways, how we could do this, we actually realized that one of the main problems is that we don't have a definition of what a food decision is. Like, when does it start and when does it end? And indeed, as we just said, is a habit a decision? So basically, is a decision, can it be unconscious or automatic? And you can, for instance, think about the example of eating a sandwich, which seems like a simple decision. But, you can want a sandwich because you're hungry or because you're bored. You can make it yourself or go buy it somewhere. You can decide what type of bread you want, what type of spreads or like cheese, ham, whatever you put on your sandwich. Whether you want salad with it. You can choose where to eat it. If you want to eat it while you're working behind your desk or while walking in the park, or to eat it with somebody, to log it into your calorie tracker and then decide, oh, I had, a sandwich with a lot of mayonnaise, so now I cannot have a cookie as a snack, or I don't know, there's so many.
It doesn't end.
It doesn't end. And without a clear definition, you can come up with any arbitrary number of decisions.
It seems to me you can always break it down further.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And this is a bit also what happened in the original study.
Exactly. And if we would try again, then, whatever we choose to be the level of decision that we measure, it's going to give an arbitrary number.
And how do you think researchers can start to approach this problem?
Yeah, so one approach that we think could work is to really define decisions within a particular moment or context. So, for instance, a school lunch or a meal at home or a specific grocery trip. And really decide how you define a decision in that context. So, for instance, if you're interested in what people snack while they're watching TV, you can decide the level of measurement that is important for you. So do you want to know how many calories someone ate from snacks while they're watching TV? Or do you want to know, every time someone sticks out their hand to take another crisp from the bag, what is the unit that you're interested in or that is meaningful for your research question or to help people improve their behaviors? And then there's two other dimensions that are important. And one is the time frame. You have to constrain the time frame of your context. So, do you want to know how many crisps someone ate in a year, or in a week, or in this single event. Like you decide the context, or who made the decision. So you can think about, is it the individual eating the crisps that you're interested in, or is it the person in the household who bought the bag of crisps in the first place that then ended up in the house? I think it's more clear maybe if you think about it in terms of what kind of intervention do you want to do, or who do you want to help? So, do you want to help the person to restrain themselves and say, no, I will not eat another crisps? Or do you want to make the overall environment in the house healthier? So then you would, be interested more in the person buying the snacks. And only when you have these elements, you can define what this, what the decision would then mean in your study or in your question, for your question. And another aspect that's important is to try to use objective methods. For instance, observing people. So instead of subjective methods, as in asking people what they ate, like they did in, or how many decisions they made, like they did in the Wansink and Sobel study, because then you get these biases that people don't remember what they ate, or they don't want to tell you what they ate. So if you find a way of objectively measuring decisions or the behavior, like recording or asking for grocery receipts, for instance, like all the snacks that someone bought. Ways like this, you can objectively measure the decisions. And so this method doesn't give you a fancy estimate.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It gives you an estimate for that context in that moment.
Yes. But it's much more precise, and it tells you maybe much more about the processes or the quality of the decisions within that context, which then allows you to do something with it, rather than just saying, oh yeah, there's 200 decisions that people make. But then, which of these decisions is important to target? You don't know.
You mentioned a study by Mattea Dall'Aca as a good example of your approach. Could you explain what that study involved?
Sure. So Mattea Dall'Aca and her colleagues invited families to come have a meal in a laboratory. So it was actually usually a caregiver and then a child that were invited to have a meal. And they actually had 2 meals. And one of the meals lasted the typical duration that the family meal would take at home. And then the other one was extended by 50%, which on average was 10 minutes. And the order with which these families had this meal was randomized. So, one family would have first a shorter meal, and then 1 or 3 weeks later, the longer meal. And then other families had it the other way around. So first the longer meal and then the shorter meal.
The kids were 6 to 11 years old, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
So not super young.
No, yeah. And so at the lab, they got a meal prepared for them. So it was a typical German dinner with bread, cold cuts, some desserts cookies and pudding, pieces of fruits and vegetables. And I think they could drink water and soft drinks. So this was a bit the setup, and they could drink whatever they wanted. And it was measured how much they ate, and they were also video recorded while they were eating. So the researchers could really see exactly what was happening, when a child was taking what, and they basically counted every piece of food that the children ate. And they found that the children when they were eating in the longer meal, on average, they ate more fruits and vegetables, more of the pieces of fruits and vegetables than in the shorter mealtime. But they did not eat more of the unhealthy foods. So not more cookies or more pudding, also not more bread. And the nice thing about the study is that because it was so controlled in the lab, so first of all, we have a very objective estimate of how much was eaten, but also because the order of the meals were randomized, we can really say that, when you extend the meal by so much, children eat healthier foods. And the researchers explained this effect by saying that, the fruits and vegetables were cut in small pieces, so they were probably more convenient to eat by the kids than them, preparing another sandwich with bread and cheese. So that was their explanation. But you can also think about other explanations longer meals also being more relaxed. And when the atmosphere is better, children also tend to eat healthier than when it's a stressed environment.
And based on your approach, what other methods do you think could be useful for objectively measuring food decisions?
For instance, if you're interested in what families buy as grocery shopping, you can ask them for grocery receipts to have a more objective measure than asking them, okay, what did you buy? Or you can use like an online shopping environment, or not a fake one, but the actual ones where you do your grocery shopping. We can observe people, so either in the lab with video recording or even at home. You can ask them to record meals, but also like record other things in the environment. So, for instance, looking at how often people use their fridge, like when they open it, and what they take out, but also like if they just open it and look inside and then are like, okay, no, maybe I will not have anything, and then close it again. Now we have so many like smartphone apps or wearables like smart watches, etc. that can also tell us a lot. So like the GPS location can tell you like how far someone is from like a food outlet or fast food outlet, and you can use all these types of information to like track how people are influenced, for instance, by their environment. There's tools like so wearables, like if you wear a watch, it can tell you how often you bring your spoon or fork to your mouth. There's in-ear headphones that can tell you how often someone chews their food. So yeah, all this sort of fancy measurements. But I would also like to highlight that this gives you like super rich data that is very objective, but we could also think about different contexts where it might be interesting to qualitatively assess food decisions. And then, all this conversation that we're having is very much about food decisions in our world, let's say. But you can think about other countries or other cultures where food decisions look very differently. And there it would maybe help to have in-depth interviews with people to just get a better idea of how food decisions work there. Before we start, measuring them with tools that we think food decisions work. But, in some cultures, it's much more of a social happening. And there you would, you maybe need something else than measuring with a watch how often someone eats. So these are some ways.
So for me, one of the big takeaways from your paper is that instead of relying on like a magic number, like 200 food decisions a day, we should be focusing more on context, understanding more where decisions are made and how they are made. And for the parents watching us, what do you think could help them have their kids eat healthier at home? So based on research, right? What are science-based strategies that parents could use to have their kids eat better?
Yes, I can give you a couple. So this is mostly based on, again, work by Mattea Dalaker and colleagues. So also Vanessa Knobbel and I'm also looking at sort of these family strategies that you can use in the family meal. And Mattea first did a meta-analysis. So that's basically a summary of like all the studies who are looking at these strategies, and she found a couple that seemed to work best. And then now we're like looking more deeply into which strategies seem more effective. And for one of them is the one that we saw, like extending the meal duration. So tends to lead children to eat more healthy foods. Another one is creating a positive atmosphere. So maybe not having too strict rules about what kids can and cannot eat, can make them more relaxed. And also having like conversation while you're eating a meal, trying to talk about nice things. A third one that seems to work quite well is to remove like smartphones and television from the meal. So we know from a lot of research that when we're distracted, we tend to eat more and unhealthier. But you can also think about it in terms of the positive atmosphere. So if everybody at the meal is like on their phone, it's you're not going to chat to each other, and it's also going to be less nice. And then there are some strategies that maybe need a bit more research still. So, for instance, duration one, it was tested in this very controlled setting, so we can really see that it worked. And then some of the other routines, it doesn't mean that they're not as effective, but we haven't yet tested them in such a controlled environment. But some of them can be like preparing your own food at home and then involving the child in the preparation. You are in charge of what goes into the meal, and if your child is part of the process, they're also more likely to want to try the food or eat it because they feel like they contributed to it. Then we have it helps if the parents carry out the behavior, like model the behavior that they want their kid to carry out. So if you eat fruits and vegetables, then the kids are also more likely to eat them. And this also works for like when teachers do it or in these kind of settings. And I would also like to mention 2 strategies that work for adults. So they might also work for children. And that's keeping like healthy foods where they are easy to reach and where you can see them. So for instance, would mean putting healthy foods in at the bottom of your fridge so that like children can reach it, and maybe in see-through containers so that you can see what's inside, and also preparing healthy snacks beforehand. So like if you're hungry or you just want to eat something, then it's easy to like grab a little pre-made candy or like a bag of crisps, but you're not going to take a cucumber, peel it, and cut it up. But if you do this prep work before, so you have your pieces of cucumber ready, then you might just take that one instead of the crisps. And it's a bit about like redesigning your environments such that the healthy choice becomes the easy and default one.
These are contextual interventions, so to say, but parents would still then need, when it comes to having kids eating more fruits and vegetables, the food still has to be provided, of course, right?
Yes.
This goes without saying. And it's also interesting that somehow just having people spending time together and have a nice time together seems to go a long way in having kids eat more healthily, right? That's a very interesting insight, I find.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Almudena. It was very nice to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
And that's a wrap for today's episode. We've discovered that instead of focusing on catchy statistics like 200 food decisions a day, the real insight lies in understanding decisions in context, where they happen, how they happen, and what shapes them. And when we do that, we start to find useful insights. For example, simply extending dinner time by 10 minutes can encourage kids to eat more fruits and vegetables. For more insights, see the show notes at unravelingbehavior.org. Thanks for listening and supporting science. Auf Wiedersehen.